conference, first international conference of the School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the American University in Cairo. The conference subject is the global and public affairs in a changing world. And one of the panels in this changing world deals with displacements. We have considered that the world has witnessed in the last 10 years 2 very large flows of human displacements. One of them is categorized as refugee displacement, asylum seekers and refugee displacement. The other one, human displacement as well, that combines migration and refugees at the same time, even though it was essentially a question of migration. Without further ado, and in order to make the best use of the 60 minutes that we are allotted, I will present very briefly our panelists this afternoon, after which I will give the floor to one of them. The panelists are Dr. Tamiras Fakhouri. Dr. Fakhouri is an associate professor of political science at Aalborg University in Copenhagen, Denmark. We also have Dr. Pablo Mateu, the country representative in Egypt of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And the third panelist is Dr. Carlos Abaunza, who is a senior researcher and adjunct faculty at the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. We have asked Dr. Abaunza to review the 2 displacements and come up with a comparative perspective. This comparative perspective is the subject of our panel. So I will ask Dr. Abaunza to give us in some 7 to 8 minutes what the main findings of his study are, what is comparable, what is different in the 2 displacement, and in particular in the regional receptions of the displacements. The reception in South America, reception in the Middle East, and the international reactions as well. My final 2 words are to just emphasize that one of the reasons of undertaking this study is also the similarity in terms of cultural identity of Syrian refugees in the Middle East and of Venezuelan migrants and refugees in South America. So the floor is yours, Dr. Abaunza, for 7 to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to go ahead and see if you can see the slides that I am sharing.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon and good morning to those of you who are following us from the Americas. Thank you, Dr. Awad, for the presentation, CMRS and GAP for this opportunity. I am truly honored to be presenting this study with such distinguished panelists. As Dr. Awad just said, the idea was to create a study that would allow us to compare the Syrian and Venezuelan refugee crisis, as they are the 2 largest displacement processes in the world as of right now. Hopefully that won't be the case, but in the near future, it might be that Ukraine would surpass the numbers that we see right now in the Syrian conflict and the Venezuelan conflict. In order to do this, we resorted to a case study comparison methodology, which basically entails the construction of a case for the Syrian conflict, construction of a case study for the Venezuelan one, and then compare the most important features of the two. In that sense, we structured the study in order to compare drivers of displacement, main destinations, and then the regional and international responses to these displacements. Right now, in the next few minutes, I'm going to share with you the main results, a selection of the main results and conclusions. Because of time, I resorted to just sharing some of the important features that we were able to compare. As you can see, on the left hand, we have Syria, and then on the right side, we have Venezuela. Syria has produced, as of January 2022, 6.6 million externally displaced persons, almost the same amount of internally displaced persons, but externally 6.6, out of which about 5.6 million are registered as refugees, which basically amounts to 85% of the flows. In contrast, we have Venezuela that has produced about a little over 6 million externally displaced persons, out of which only 2.3 are recognized as refugees. This allows us to understand that Syria, the Syrian conflict, is basically a refugee-producing conflict, while the Venezuela conflict is a migrant-producing one, with all that entails. As we compare the demographics, we also see that Venezuelans were able to resort to different strategies in which some elderly and some minors were able to stay in the country, whereas the refugee flows do not allow for that. People have to escape in order to save their lives in many circumstances. Also, as you notice, the countries, we have Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt as the main destinations. Obviously, obviously, according to this data, people have resorted to neighboring countries first and then regional countries. And so has been the case of Venezuela, where we see Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Brazil as the main destinations. Other destinations that are not regional were United States and Spain, both of which received about 500,000 people each. The Syrian and Venezuelan conflicts are, as you know, now entering year 10 of their, year 10 for Venezuela, over year 10 for Syria, year 12, 13 for many of these people. And with that comes the humanitarian cost that is behind these flows. In short, as you can see there, for the Syrian case, both internally and externally displaced persons amount to about 13.4 million people, out of which all of them are in need of assistance, and many of them in need of protection. As of right now, the international response has allowed to reach about 6.7 million people. When you compare the required funding and the current funding, you see that we have $4.2 billion, and out of which only 1.9 has been allocated. This Venezuelan case is also staggering. We have 7 million people in need, out of which 2 million have been reached. The required funding as of right now, according to the United Nations, is $708 million, out of which only 260 has been allocated. This allows us to understand many different things, among which is the large amounts of people, in the millions of people who lack basic services, basic goods. We're now talking about, the inability to eat 3 times a day in some cases, this leading not only to malnutrition, but also to deaths, which unfortunately, during the winter, it increases. Also, as you can see for the Syrian case, but it's also the same for the Venezuelan one, 80% of people abroad live below the poverty line. And this implies not only lack of resources, but also lack of opportunities for entering the job market, whether the labor market, whether formally or informally, having access to basic services, and children having access to education. And finally, we have children. In the case of the Syrian conflict, we have 2.5 million refugee children who are out of school right now, out of which, in addition, in the next few months, an approximate number of 1.6 million are at risk of dropping out as well. Staggering numbers. In the case of Venezuela, of the Venezuelan children abroad, they're also not having access to education in most cases. And also, as these flows are constantly changing, they're constantly changing destinations. They're in processes of finding better destinations. You also see that there are a lot of, in the thousands, children that are traveling unaccompanied, alone, and family separation as well. Just to finish, some of the main findings and conclusions. The Syrian conflict then, as we have expressed before, is mostly a refugee-producing crisis, while the Venezuelan conflict is mostly a migrant-producing one. In both cases, we observe that displaced persons have resorted to neighboring countries. This is evidently not applicable for elites who usually have resources to go usually to the global north. Also, receiving large numbers of externally displaced persons does not only involve a lot of economic sacrifices on the part of the local communities, but also on the part of the national ones. The longer externally displaced populations stay in a host country, the greater the likelihood is for us to see social discontent grow into full-fledged discrimination and xenophobic sentiments, which is happening right now in Turkey, in Chile, in Brazil. And finally, even though both the Syrian and Venezuelan are large oil producer countries with the ability to upset international, energy markets, both have produced over 6 million externally displaced persons. The difference in funding, which is 325%, allows us to suggest that there are geopolitical implications in the way in which big donors, international donors, craft their response, which we can explore later on as we enter into our conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abaunza, for your very enlightening presentation. Your paper is much richer, of course. You only had 7 to 8 minutes, and therefore you focused on the most important findings. I have to apologize to the attendees because I did not introduce myself. I'm Ibrahim Awad. I'm professor of practice of Global Affairs and Director of Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University in Cairo. I should have introduced myself first, but this was lost on me with the excitement of the panel and of the subject. Now, having listened to Dr. Abaunza, and of course, having also gone over the study, Dr. Fakhouri, what are your reactions to the comparative perspective? What do you think? Is this comparative perspective justified? And what is similar and what is dissimilar? And how did countries in the Middle East, in particular Lebanon and Jordan, Lebanon with the highest rate of refugees to the population, how was the reaction at the beginning, and how was the reaction with the crisis that became protracted.
Thank you so much, Dr. Awad, first of all, for hosting me in this enlightening roundtable. I should say that this is such a timely and relevant event because there is so little research that has been actually made on comparing Syrian and Venezuelan displacements. So it is really an honor to be contributing to this debate. So I would like, against the backdrop of Carlos' presentation, to speak a little bit about conceptions and ideas of responsibility sharing in the context of mass displacement from Syria and from Venezuela. And so allow me just to start with a broad question. When we talk about displacement and responsibility sharing, what is it exactly that we mean? So this is a very fuzzy and polysemous term that has created much contention historically. So an important debate on different ways of international solidarity or refugee sharing has gained ground in the international system as early as when the League of Nations was established. So back then, an important international conference took place in 1938 in Evian, where 32 states met to discuss the problem of refugees from Germany. So since then, the topic of responsibility sharing or how to deal in solidarity with a protracted refugee challenge has evolved into a pressing issue, but it has never yielded consensus. In fact, the preamble to the 1951 UN Refugee Convention enshrines the importance of international cooperation over protracted refugee challenges. Still, until now, there is no legal framework as to how states would share the burden or cooperate in multilateral platforms to share the responsibility of displacement. So against this backdrop, there is this tension between the ethics of refugee protection and, of course, the sovereignty of nation states. So the arising question for today is, what have been the existing forms of international responsibility sharing, in both Syria and Venezuela, and what practices and actions have states resorted to in order to share responsibility? So as we know, states may choose to share the burden financially by channeling funds, geographically by taking in refugees, and politically by finding political solutions for conflicts and problems instigating displacement, or even ideationally by sharing norms and practices and best lessons or lessons learned on how to respond to displacement. So coming back to our empirical field, which is mass displacement from Syria and from Venezuela, I would like just to take perhaps a couple of minutes to talk about the specific case of mass displacement from Syria, which has turned out to be one of the most protracted humanitarian and refugee crises in our history. And what comes to mind here when we allude to this critical turning point is that states have chosen to share the refugee burden very asymmetrically in the end, in the light of their clashing interests. So a brief examination of refugee figures released from the UNHCR attests to this story. Regional refugee hosting countries such as Lebanon and Jordan have hosted more than 2 million displaced Syrians since 2011. So this amounts to more than 25% of their populations. In Europe, the most generous European countries have been Sweden and Germany, and the least generous, is Great Britain. So such patterns and geographies of hosting have provided a key terrain for us, researchers and practitioners for understanding the dynamics and implications of unequal burden sharing. So as we all know, more affluent states, including Western and Gulf donor states, have chosen to contribute to the Syrian refugee issue through the lens of fiscal or financial burden sharing. So I'm going to specifically refer in my very brief intervention to the example of the European Union's approach to financial burden sharing in Lebanon and Jordan, and will briefly talk about its implications. So in the wake of mass displacement from Syria, the EU has been one of the top donors in the Syria region. It has promoted the script of resilience building as a guiding narrative for cooperating with partner governments such as Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, that have taken on many refugees, but that have actually refrained from developing a rights-based approach to the refugee challenge. So the EU has stepped in really in order to build Syria's neighboring countries' capacity to respond to the refugee challenge, while boosting refugees' self-reliance and improving their access to livelihoods and protection. So examples that really come to mind are the 2016 EU-Lebanon and the EU-Jordan compacts, celebrated first as innovative examples that showcase the various beneficial effects that financial burden sharing could bring on the ground. So very briefly, these compacts allocate financial aid with a view to boosting job creation, economic opportunities, in exchange for both Jordanian and Lebanese governments easing Syrian refugees' access to legal residency and to the labor market. Of course, at first glance, these instruments may seem like an attempt to share the burden by creating options for displaced individuals and by easing the strains on refugee hosting countries. These compacts, as research has shown, have, however, remained disconnected from the creation of sustainable legal remedies for refugees, and ultimately they ended up feeding into the broader logic of temporariness. And here I'm borrowing from Elizabeth Ferris, who says that refugees will end up remaining where they are in conditions short of full local integration, and that somehow they will get by. Lebanon here arises as a case in point. Indeed, in the light of Lebanon's cascading crises, ranging from the financial collapse to the Beirut blasts, more than 70% of Syrian refugees have slipped into extreme poverty, and only 20% of them have been able to acquire legal residency, despite the EU's efforts, in boosting resilience building. So in Jordan, the situation has been a bit different because Jordan has welcomed the EU's financial aid, as it has a historical tradition of extracting revenue from, financial aid. So it has closely cooperated with the EU on creating jobs for displaced Syrians. However, we know by now that though many Syrian refugees have gotten job permits, these job permits are not to be confused with decent and dignifying work and with the creation of sustainable legal remedies. I'm going to stop here, and then if we have the chance in my upcoming intervention, perhaps I will take this opportunity to carry out a comparative assessment between Syria and the Venezuelan case in order to derive broader insights. Thank you so much. I guess you are muted, Dr. Brahim.
I'm sorry about that. I said thank you very much for your intervention, and we certainly look forward to your perspective on the comparison between the two displacements. Dr. Matteo, UNHCR has been signaled time and again by Dr. Abawunza, by Dr. Fahouri, and Dr. Fahouri referred to the international cooperation in burden sharing, which figures in the preamble of the 1951 Convention. And I'd like to remind Dr. Fahouri that a few years ago in 2017, here in Cairo at AUC, we held a conference on international cooperation on responsibility sharing and burden sharing. The Global Compact was supposed to come up with some elaboration on burden sharing, on responsibility sharing, on how to go about it. In reality, not much really has been added by the Global Compact. So I'd like to know what you think about this on the one hand, but then, of course, about what is your perspective on Syrian and Venezuelan displacement. Venezuelan displacement has been categorized first as a migration issue, but then we see that there are quite a few that have the right to seek protection under the Refugee Convention. And then, of course, there is the Cartagena Declaration that also allows Venezuelan displaced people to claim protection. And finally, just as like quite interestingly in the study by Dr. Baunza, I find that Colombia has come up with a temporary protection status for Venezuelan migrants. Quite interesting, because usually it is for asylum seekers or for forced displaced population. So the floor is yours. We're all ears.
Thank you very much, Dr. Awad, and thank you to the other panelists. I would like to express my appreciation to the Center for Migration and Refugee Studies at the American University of Cairo, because, you know, I think it is important to have this research capacity, not just in the global north, but also throughout the world. So, and thank you, Carlos, for this very interesting study, and which I think now, as you were saying, with the unfortunate situation in Ukraine, then, you know, we may have a third massive case study. I said unfortunately because I don't think it's a positive thing, but I think, you know, your findings and the research that you have done may be also useful for this purpose. I will, Dr. Awad, try to answer your questions, and maybe after, you know, a few comments on the research document. On the Global Compact on refugees, as you know, there was quite a lot of pressure on UNHCR to try to either revise the 1951 convention or to add an additional protocol. And it was decided that this may actually not be the best way forward. So that's how the Global Compact on refugees came up as a non-binding document, right? And that non-binding character, I think, on the compact may be, on the one hand, a positive thing, but also on the other hand, you know, maybe less ideal, because then it's up to member states and other actors to take action, right? As you know, there is also something called the Global Refugee Forum, which was held in 2019, where member states, but not just UN member states, but also the private sector, academic institutions, etc., made pledges, right? And that was supposed to somehow take care of the burden sharing aspect to a certain extent, right? Now, of course, a lot of pledges were made there. Some have been implemented, others are work in progress, right? And others stayed basically at the level of good words only, right? So following up on those pledges and making sure that they are substantive and contribute more to, you know, responsibility and burden sharing is something that we need to prioritize. Now, on the, you mentioned the Cartagena Declaration, which I think it was a very pragmatic approach in Latin America and the Caribbean to deal with forced displacement that didn't perfectly fit, you know, the 1951 convention and the definition that is included there, because remember that the convention was established after the European refugee crisis, right? And so I think in Latin America, and very wisely, you know, countries decided that they needed to broaden the definition to do that. And I think that's quite useful in the case of the Venezuelan displacement, because it's not a very clear-cut situation. And I think that's why countries like Colombia are coming up yet again with a very pragmatic approach to deal with that lack of clarity on, whether those Venezuelans who have left massively the country are actually refugees or migrants. Now, on that, Carlos, one of the things that I was going to say is that the study uses a lot of terms interchangeably, and some terms that I think, I don't know to what extent they are accepted definitions, like externally displaced persons, right? So, and I don't know if that was one effort to somehow capture everybody, but I was thinking that, it is important to still keep, the terminology right and still make the difference between refugees, migrants, and other types of movements. For example, in the case of Egypt, Syrians are still coming to Egypt, but they're no longer seeking asylum. They're no longer approaching UNHCR. They tend to be middle-class Syrians who see no future for the time being in Syria, and they would like to invest in Egypt, right? I wouldn't call those externally displaced persons because, they're basically, economic migrants, foreign investors. I mean, I think we need to be very clear, that the fact that you have left your country of origin, even if there is a conflict, right, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have been displaced, quote unquote, right? So I think, we should be very careful when we use some terms. I was thinking also that in the case of Venezuela, an interesting comparison, but of course it took place at different times and it's not so massive, would be the case of Zimbabweans who left for very similar reasons to those of Venezuelans, and they went to neighboring countries, more particularly to South Africa. Now, of course, the population of Zimbabwe is half of that of Venezuela, so obviously you didn't see, millions and millions of Zimbabweans leaving, but that could be interesting. The other thing, Carlos, I agree with you that refugees and migrants impose a heavy burden on host communities and host countries, but they also contribute to them, right? And I didn't see that positive aspect of migration and of refugees. I mean, a lot of the cash that is given to refugees in Jordan, in Lebanon, in Egypt, etc., goes into the local economy. A lot of the small businesses that Syrians have established, for example, in Damietta or in Alexandria, they are actually employing Egyptians. I have visited and I have met with quite a few of them, and it's quite impressive how many Egyptians are actually employed by Syrian refugees. So I think, we need to nuance a little bit when we talk about the burden, because, it's not a black and white situation. Obviously, there's a lot of exploitation also by host communities of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants, right? So we also need to be careful. It's not everything is very rosy. And then on the xenophobic and anti-migrant or refugee sentiments, I was wondering, if there are any studies in countries like Egypt, for example, that could tell us what are the attitudes of Egyptians or of Lebanese. Maybe Dr. Fakouri can tell us whether there are any attitudinal surveys that can show us whether these sentiments are actually increasing or whether they are still the same, or what is the situation in the different countries, so that we can say, yes, the situation is actually getting worse, and not just rely on anecdotal evidence. And finally, on burden sharing, as you know, countries like China now have quite a lot of resources, and I was wondering, to what extent we are factoring countries like China in the equation of responsibility and burden sharing, particularly in countries like Venezuela and Syria, where I think Western countries have taken quite a different approach to supporting and investing the regimes in Venezuela and in Syria. So your views on this will also be appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Mateo, for your contribution. And I wish to thank you in particular for pointing out the contributions of refugees to the host countries. Because refugees, yes, of course, there is responsibility for them that costs countries of destination, host countries, but they also contribute to the economies where they are. They contribute by their labor, by their work. They contribute as consumers as well. So there are contributions that should not be overlooked. I also, I'm very grateful for signaling the Zimbabwean displacement. Zimbabwean, Ukrainian, so this could enable us to do broader comparative studies. Of course, in the case of Ukrainian displacement, what is different is that displacement is towards countries that are not developing countries. But what is common to Venezuelan displacement, Zimbabwean displacement, and Syrian displacement is that they go to countries, the same regions, which are all developing countries. So thank you very much for signaling that. I turn now to Dr. Abaunza. What are your reactions to the ideas expressed by Dr. Fakhouri and Dr. Mateo?
Yes, thank you both for your remarks and also for your insightful comments. I do believe that that yes, it is important to use concepts and terms with a lot of care. The externally displaced term is used now by all of the reports that UNHCR is producing on the Venezuelan case. So I thought of using it also for the Syrian case, since it is it should be a common language which within UN agencies. But yeah, it is true. For instance, there is a concept that I would like to bring forward, and that I'm in the process of expressing it to the academic community, which is an analytical concept that would allow us to make a distinction between forced migration and forceful migration. Forced being that of conflict zones, for instance, where there is no option. If you stay, you might die or your family might die. And forceful would be occasions where people take the decision to leave. Their lives are not in danger, but staying is also not an option. So it's a voluntary process, confined, due to the circumstances surrounding the events. So I'm in the process also of trying to bring this forward to the academic community, because I think it would allow us to talk about certain differences, like for instance, Syrians would be forced displacement, while Venezuelans would be an example of forceful displacement. Nevertheless, I do thank you very much for this comment, because I do have to revise that all the same concepts and terms are being used correctly. There are many studies that have just come out in the past year and a half about these xenophobic sentiments that I was talking about. So it's no longer an anecdotal thing, but actually real studies being published in scientific journals. For instance, Kagan has addressed the case of Turkey, and so how the Syrian populations in different parts of Turkey are now suffering different kinds of violent and aggressive behavior towards them. Now, so much that they're resorting, different parts of the country now resorting to refugee camps because they feel more protected, less in the public eye than otherwise, as they would be in rural or urban areas. So there are different studies, but I do agree that more studies are needed, that this needs a longitudinal approach, as you said, in order to see if these are actually sparks of new occurrences or has always been there in the first place. I thank you so much for the comment. I do agree with Dr. Fahouri with everything she said. I think we need to establish a conversation now about unequal burden sharing, and also what has been the international response, because as much as I wouldn't like to take any sides, I have noticed within the scope of the study that that the international community has been very unequal with these two type of responses. Obviously, there is the whole thing of the background that one crisis has produced refugees and the other one has produced migrants. But when I explore further into the possible causes of this disparity, there are things that are quite unsettling that come up. And finally, I do thank you, Dr. Mateo, for this comment of refugees not only being a burden, or migrants not only being a burden, but also contributing to local economies. Actually, within the backdrop of COVID-19, doctors, nurses, practitioners, Venezuelan practitioners who left actually were of incredible help for many different countries in South America to give a better response to COVID-19 emergencies. So they were hired both formally and informally in order to help. And also, unfortunately, couldn't find, I read the study and then I couldn't find it back for this presentation, but I do remember reading that the Colombian economy grew 2.3% last year, where everybody else, because of COVID, their economies were either stagnant or in negative numbers. Their economy grew, and these researchers were equating the presence of refugees, highly skilled refugees migrants from Venezuela, contributing very positively to the Colombian economy. So thank you very much for this. I will include this in the study.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abaunza, for reacting to the interventions of Dr. Fahouri and Dr. Mateo. I turn again to Dr. Fahouri, and she promised to go over the two displacement comparatively. And I would like her also to tell us what she thinks about the xenophobic attitudes that develop with time. And then also, she probably would like to say a few words about an idea which already brought to the conversation about the geopolitical considerations in reacting to displacements. We see the difference in financial assistance to the Venezuelan and to the Syrian displacements. And we have seen recently how geopolitical considerations have entered the scene when it came to the Ukrainian displacement. So could you please tell us what you think about all these issues, please?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for all of these fascinating questions. So I wanted to just briefly first take stock of international burden sharing in the context of both Venezuelan and Syrian displacements and come up with some perhaps comparative remarks. So as I was doing my research, I found out that we have seen some similar trends of solidarity and burden sharing, namely the establishment of funding appeals and the emergence of large-scale coordination platforms. As Carlos, however, eloquently illustrated, it's generally agreed that the global humanitarian response to the Venezuelan case has remained chronically and significantly underfunded. Notwithstanding this fact, we have seen in both cases the involvement of global actors, and the role of the UNHCR comes to mind here. And I would like to briefly, talk about the UNHCR as a norm entrepreneur and its importance in, pushing this narrative of international burden sharing. So in both cases, the UNHCR has played not only a role in coordinating its protection approach with hosting governments, but it has also launched various calls for scaling up international burden sharing and shying away from a security-driven approach to the issue of displacement, both in Venezuela and in Syria. So in both cases, the UNHCR has launched anti-discrimination campaigns. It has advocated for host governments to facilitate access to education, housing, and more generally, rights. Also, in both cases, the UNHCR has come up with an ambitious regional response plan. So in the case of Syria, we have seen the emergence of what the UNHCR calls the Refugee Resilience Plan, or the 3RP. And in the case of Venezuelan displacement, the UNHCR has spearheaded in coordination with the IOM, the Regional Refugee and Migrant Response Plan, or the so-called RMRP. Both plans, bring together several multi-level stakeholders spanning governments, civil society actors, and NGOs to coordinate their responses on refugee and migrant rights and improve their access to services. So what I found interesting is that the regional plan in the case of Venezuela has brought together 17 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, hosting around 84% of all displaced Venezuelan. So it would be interesting to see here, how this multi-scale response to displacement, what kind of, results-oriented, outputs has it led to in both Syria and Venezuela, cross-comparatively. So in both cases as well, the EU and its member states have mobilized millions of euros for humanitarian, technical, and longer-term development assistance. However, in the case of the EU, we see, in a way, how geopolitics matters. And in this case, for instance, the proximity of Syria or the presence of Syria in the so-called EU's southern neighborhood, has prompted the EU to devise, various external funding instruments in order to ensure that, displaced Syrians remain where they are and perhaps are deterred, from reaching the EU or accessing its territory. So here we need to debate a little bit more how financial burden sharing has spilled, over to extraterritorial migration control. I don't have time to talk about this, but I'm happy to answer questions later on. So how about geographical burden sharing? If you want to take stock of some comparative trends, and I guess this is where the hotbed controversy, comes into stark relief. Well, this form of burden sharing has been heavily criticized in both cases. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to give some, brief or limited examples. So in the Syrian case, we are all too familiar with the EU's failure by 2016 to agree on relocation and refugee sharing quotas, right? Also, we may mention the highly asymmetrical patterns of burden sharing across European states, whereby Germany and Sweden, as I said at the outset, have taken most of Syrian refugees, whereas other countries have displayed only symbolic solidarity. Additionally, I think we need to linger a moment and to talk about the pandemic and how it has provided a pretext for countries in both the Syria region, including Lebanon and Jordan and Turkey, and further afield in the global north, to enforce more restrictive policies, curbing Syrian refugees' arrivals, including indefinitely postponing in some of cases their resettlement applications. And here I'm of course alluding to the case of traditional resettlement countries such as Australia. So when it comes to the displaced Venezuelans, we have seen comparable trends of unequal burden sharing that need, of course, to be interpreted in the light of geopolitics. So the United States comes here to mind with the example of the Trump presidency severely restricting access to the US asylum system. And the situation has been further exacerbated by COVID-19 border closures between Mexico and the US, whereby stranded Venezuelans in Mexico have been indefinitely waiting to lodge asylum claims. From March 2021, however, the US has designated Venezuela as a temporary protection status country. So here it would be interesting, to study who is included, who is excluded, what are the geopolitical implications of, such an initiative. Of course, I don't have time to discuss it, but I'm happy to answer questions later on. In the EU, when it comes to the Venezuelan displacement, we have also seen, patterns of asylum and international protection for Venezuelans that have been characterized by vast discrepancies. So Spain remains the primary destination for asylum seekers from Venezuela, but there is much criticism here regarding Spain granting only very few Venezuelan refugee status. And of course, we have to talk about the geopolitical implications of all this and what it means, especially that Carlo has strongly alluded to the fact that the Venezuelan issue has been, framed or categorized as a migrant crisis rather than a refugee crisis. So what do these taxonomies and terminologies mean, and how do they infringe on people's rights and ability to access protection, in the hosting countries regionally, but also further afield? Last but not least, and I would like to close after this remark, we have seen a similar hosting pattern in both cases whereby neighboring countries have taken in most refugees. At the same time, this has, however, led in both cases to a situation whereby regional refugee hosting countries such as Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, or Lebanon, or Jordan, of course, comparatively, have flagged the strains that they are incurring, pressuring displaced individuals to leave or return to their countries of origin. So here, coming back to your question, Professor Awad, I would like to say that though, there are many surveys talking about the tensions between host and refugee communities, perhaps we need to stop a minute and also factor in how political regimes have geopoliticized in both cases, the case of migrants and refugees, or the general case of displacement, in order to push for their electoral and geopolitical agendas. However, I would like at the same time to note that in a Venezuelan case, we have seen some noteworthy, achievements whereby regional refugee hosting countries such as Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia have come up at the outset, so towards, 2014, with various innovative measures to welcome displaced individuals. When we compare this with the initiatives that Lebanon and Jordan have come up with, I would say that perhaps initiatives in the Americas have been a bit more ambitious. So indeed, to put things in perspective, let me cite finally what Assistant High Commissioner for Operations Raouf Matsou of the UNHCR has said a couple of days ago, when he reminded us that funding is only one way of showing solidarity in large-scale displacement, as the Syrian, Venezuelan, or more recently, the Ukrainian examples. And perhaps we need to, try as much as possible to draw on all of these, junctures of displacement to derive broader insights and to take, broader lessons. How can we take stock of what has happened? What have we learned, and what can we do better regionally, nationally, and internationally? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fahouri. Thank you very much for your contributions. I wish to emphasize in particular what you said at the very end about the more ambitious measures, more ambitious policies for the reception and for the hosting of displaced populations in South America. There are certainly causes, reasons that explain this more ambitious reception and more ambitious hosting environment that was created by governments in Peru, in Colombia, and in other countries in South America. You also referred to the geopolitical considerations that determined the reactions of actors such as the European Union. You mentioned the Jordan Compact, and in 2016, right after the year of extremely large flows, this has to be put in perspective. It's not a coincidence that the Jordan Compact is reached in February or March 2016. So thank you for pointing this out, and thank you also for pointing out the issues, housing, education issues that are really fundamental in hosting displaced populations. Dr. Matteo, the UNHCR has been signaled time and again, and positively. The plans that have been put in place, the ideas that UNHCR vehicles that creates that constructs the environment in which displaced populations are received. What can you say? What can you say about the interaction of geopolitical considerations with the normative considerations that should guide our action, and how these were articulated in the two regions in South America and in the Middle East? You will have the last intervention, after which I'll say a few words and then close this panel. Dr. Matteo.
No, very quickly, and many thanks, Dr. Fahouri, because you mentioned quite a lot of things that relate to the work of UNHCR. No, I just wanted to say that as Dr. Fahouri mentioned, I think these regional platforms are extremely useful. You see, UNHCR has a very clear mandate, right? And we have to stick to it because it's the only way to somehow avoid all these geopolitical considerations, right? I remember when I started my career, it was in Central America, and when people started accusing UNHCR, oh, you're supporting guerrilla movements in Guatemala or El Salvador, I said, look, we're also helping Nicaraguans who are actually against the regime in Nicaragua, right? And they are right wings. So I said, this is what we have to do. We cannot take sides. We have to maintain a very clear protection and humanitarian mandate, because otherwise, we would be pulled into directions that I think will not be useful for those that we are trying to serve and protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matteo, for your final ideas regarding the role and the functions that should be those of UNHCR. I think that the discussion has been extremely useful, and I hope it will be even more useful in the future in shedding light on the large issues of displacement that the world is witnessing. The victims are those who are displaced, first and foremost. Their displacement raises issues, raises problems for the countries that host them in the absence of an internationally effective refugee reaction. We hope, I personally hope, that the reactions to displacement henceforth will reinforce a unitary and single normative framework for refugees hosting and reception. Some developments signal differences in receiving refugees, in welcoming some, in rejecting, in refusing to refuse some, opening arms to some refugees, closing borders for some other refugees, which may signal, in fact, a fragmentation of the international refugee system along regional lines. And rather than a rule-based international system, we'll end up, if we continue in this path, we will end up with a fragmented, regionally based system and not the rule-based international system that many hope for, many wish to govern international relations, whether these relations relate to refugees or to others. Because if you go the way of regionalizing the international order in the field of refugees, you may end up regionalizing the international order in all other segments of the international system. So I think the comparative perspective helps us confirm, affirm, emphasize that we are in one world, in one international system, in one global system, which should be governed and ruled by the same norms and the same rules. Thank you very much, Dr. Fahouri, for your most enlightening interventions. Thank you very much, Dr. Matteo, for your extremely rich contributions. And Dr. Abaunza, my gratitude to you for carrying out this study, which was the basis for our discussions. We look forward to finalizing this study. I will probably go back to Dr. Fahouri and to Dr. Matteo, asking them for some reactions in order to finalize the study. And this will not be the last webinar that we organize around the international refugee regime, but the international norms that should govern our reactions. Thank you very much, and thank you very much for those participants, for the attendees in the Middle East, in South America, in Europe. Thank you very much, and see you soon, hopefully. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Shukran.
Lucky. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a usted. Hasta luego. Chao, Carlos. Chao.
Chao.